by the fall, what was inferior man rebelled against what was superior God. And therefore, the result would be what was inferior in man, animal, bodily desires, would rebel against what was superior in man, reason. So this then is exactly what shame is manifesting, a disintegration of what was previously integrated in man. Now, the consequences of that are obviously fairly serious for Adam and Eve, and for me and you as historical man, as sharing in this fallen state. And John Paul II in this chapter is quite meticulous in bringing out the consequences, especially the consequences for Adam and Eve, and in the light of them for any spouses or for the relationship between the different sexes, full stop. The first consequence is what he calls insufficiency or insatiability of bodily union. Basically, what this means is that because of this fracture in man between the reason and the bodily desires, bodily union does not achieve personal union in the same way as it did before. In the pristine state of man, the integration of what was bodily and what was reason in man would mean that bodily union would be a way to achieve personal union. But when sexual desire has become disordered, bodily union does not achieve personal union, at least to the same degree, if at all. So, contrary to what you might read in Vogue, disordered sexual desire will cause less satisfaction in sexual intercourse. This is what he means by insatiability, because the goal of sexual intercourse was personal communion between two married persons. And there's a certain satisfaction in that because that is the goal. When you achieve the goal of something, you experience a satisfaction. Now, disordered sexual desire, this disintegration of what is the bodily desires from reason, mean that the bodily union cannot be the vehicle for the achieving of what man wants, which is, in the same way, communion, personal communion. What comes about also in this scenario is, of course, a certain domination in sexual matters. John Paul II notes that Yahweh says to Eve, "Your desire shall be for your husband, but he will lord it over you." So something has fractured again in sexual communion. There's a kind of domination. Now, women tend to experience this domination more. And to some degree, they tend to experience the insufficiency of sexual union, which is orientated only to pleasure. They're more sensitive to soulless sex, you might say. And in that way, they're not so disintegrated as men. It's kind of part of their genius. But, unfortunately, ladies, the Holy Father points out that because a woman can use her sex appeal, to put it colloquially, to manipulate a man, she can also be guilty of emotional domination in sexual matters. Now, this is a rather important fact, because it shows something of the breadth of understanding that John Paul II has about concupiscence. Concupiscence is not just about self-gratification in regard to pleasure, sexual pleasure. It can also include an egotistical desire for emotional gratification, which would be more on the side of what would happen in a disordered woman, where an egotistical desire for physical gratification is more what happens on the side of a disordered man. But both are a kind of concupiscence, because in both cases, the person is willing to use the sexual faculty and their body or the body of another as a mere instrument for some egotistical gratification. So we have a very broad definition of concupiscence. This is why I was saying, I think John Paul II starts with a Thomistic definition and he gives a certain breadth to it. The second consequence of concupiscence is the suffocation of the spousal meaning of the body. So, another long term that we need to maybe do some unwrapping. The spousal meaning of the body, obviously a key concept in theology of the body, I would say we can define as the Sine value of the body. The body says something. It reveals something to us. It reveals that we are made for another. We are made to make a gift of ourselves for communion. How does it reveal that? I think at least in two ways. Even the somatic structure, the physical structure of a body, a male body and a female body, is a clear sign that it is made for another. And reason is able to consider that and read some intelligibility into the structure of the body. This is important in regard to what I said about the Baconian project, the project of Francis Bacon, where created reality has no meaning. If you believe created reality has no meaning, the Creator didn't put any meaning into it, of course, you will not read any meaning out of it. But we don't believe that. Well, I don't. The second aspect of the spousal meaning of the body, I would say, is this, that at a level of the sensitive appetite, the bodily appetite, there is this inclination to procreation. Men and women are inclined to the sexual act. God made it that way. Just as they're inclined to eating, one for self-preservation, one for the preservation of the race. So even at a bodily level, there is this inclination to be orientated towards another. And again, reason can consider that and read into this natural inclination some kind of vocation. This is totally, in my opinion, totally Thomistic as well. Because for St. Thomas, the natural law principles are closely tied to the natural inclinations and reason's ability to consider what these inclinations mean. Again, also John Paul II develops this at length in Veritatis Splendor. Okay, so what is the consequence of concupiscence on this? Well, clearly concupiscence means this orientation, the sexual orientation, is not towards another as a gift, but to the taking of another. So, in a way, it knows nothing of the spousal meaning of the body. A man who is disordered by concupiscence is not going to think, oh, look, I'm ordered to making a gift of myself to another. Because concupiscence has obscured this reality, this spousal meaning of the body. Now, John Paul II is very clear and precise, as he always is. It doesn't completely extinguish the spousal meaning. It kind of suffocates it, it compromises it, it threatens it. It can never kill that, because the natural inclinations are part of human nature, and you cannot lose them any more than you can lose human nature. But as St. Thomas points out, you can put innumerable obstacles in front of this inclination to give yourself to another, such that you won't ever do it. But somehow in the center of you, it will always be there as long as human nature remains. And therefore the spousal meaning is always operative in you. But, important, the spousal meaning of the body is not simply a speculative truth. It is ultimately a practical truth, meaning it is the starting point for action. By seeing what we are made for, that's the starting point for us to actually go and do it, to live lives of self-gift orientated towards communion. But again, concupiscence threatens that, because it threatens our freedom, what John Paul II, as I mentioned in the first talk this morning, calls the freedom of the gift. It means that we are weakened in self-possession. The man who is, or the woman who is taken over by concupiscence doesn't have themselves, and therefore they are not in a position to give themselves. So concupiscence threatens the so-called freedom of the gift, the starting point, the prerequisite to be able to make a gift of yourself. The third thing that concupiscence threatens is the way that spouses belong to each other. Spouses should belong to each other according to the motto of John Paul II's pontificate, totus tuus, all yours. But concupiscence downgrades this kind of possession, which is a possession proper only to persons, to a possession which is proper to things. I can have things because I take them, but I don't have my wife because I took her so much as because I gave myself to her. And if concupiscence is a reality which, as it were, threatens or frustrates the giving, it means that it frustrates or threatens the belonging. And the belonging that husbands and wives have to each other is kind of downgraded from something glorious to something equal to possessions, to be mutually used. And this, of course, is a tragedy because the spousal belonging is the highest form of belonging for human beings. I mean, it's higher than, for example, I do have my children as mine in a certain way, but not the same degree as my wife. There's something even more true about the fact that I have my wife and she has me than I have my children even, because of course they will go their own way. Well, they better not go their own way, they better go God's way, but what I mean, they won't be going my way. Okay, the fourth and the final consequence of concupiscence is what John Paul II calls the intentional reduction of woman in the heart of man. So another long phrase that we've got to unpack. This brings us to maybe the heart of the matter, because it's here in this part of the chapter too where he considers really what it means to commit adultery in the heart, which is the phrase that the saying of Christ which John Paul II is commenting on in this chapter. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery in his heart. Okay, this is the saying. So, what does it mean? What is this intentional reduction? Intentional existence, to be technical, is the existence something has in the mind of one who knows it. When I know my son, when I think of my son, he has a kind of existence in my mind, which we call intentional, and that distinguishes it from his natural existence, which he still has. I don't deprive him of existence by thinking of him. So intentional existence is existence in the mind. By intentional reduction, John Paul II means that it's possible, in a way, to give somebody a reduced existence in your mind. For the lustful man, the existence that the woman has is a kind of shadow, a poor replica of the existence she has naturally. Naturally, she is a child of God, a creature created for her own sake. That's not true of the existence she has in his mind. In his mind, she has an existence as a thing to be enjoyed. In a way, the lustful man can change the existence of the woman at an intentional level. And for this reason that John Paul II thinks favourably of an interpretation of has committed adultery with her in his heart, that changes this and says has made her an adulterer in his heart. Because that's what a lustful man does. He makes that woman, at an intentional level, an adulterer. Now, to this extent, we can understand this, what would otherwise seem an outrageous statement from the Pope, that a man can even commit adultery with his own wife in the heart. John Paul II says that. Why? Because a husband who doesn't relate to his wife according to the truth of who she is, a creature created for her own sake, in a way makes her like an adulterer in his heart. He downgrades her existence in his heart. Of course, she's not downgraded in her natural existence, but in her intentional existence. Now, what's particularly important about this part of the theology of the body is that John Paul II points out that for Christ, according to Christ, we need to move the center of gravity in moral matters to the heart. He's commenting on the sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Christ is commenting on the sixth commandment. And John Paul II is commenting on Christ's commentary on the sixth commandment. And the whole of, so that text, you have heard it said, comes from the Sermon on the Mount. And it's again and again, you have heard it said, but I say to you. It's clear that Christ is raising the bar in terms of morality, or we might say he's moving things from an exterior consideration. It's not just about adultery committed, as it were, in the flesh, two people in a in a sexual relationship who are not married. He's saying there can be even something happening in the heart which is prohibited by the sixth commandment, because the center of gravity has to move from what is simply external into what's going on inside a man. So, sixth commandment, it seems, what Jesus is doing is saying there are other concupiscent behaviors apart from actually committing adultery, which are prohibited by the sixth commandment. Now, John Paul II doesn't say what I'm about to say now, so don't blame him if I'm wrong. But given the trajectory of the theology of the body, I can only assume what he's thinking is that there is another kind of concupiscent behavior which is also precluded by the sixth commandment, and that is called contraception. He doesn't say that.